The groundwork was laid, the fear of the unknown, the search for scapegoats in times of hardship, and the evolving theological understanding of evil all converged. You, living in this volatile period, would have found yourself navigating a world where every unusual event, every unexplained illness, every stroke of bad luck could be attributed to a malevolent force. The old ways, once tolerated, were now condemned. The healers and wise women, once sought out, were now feared. The stage was set for the dark drama of the witch hunts, a period when paranoia would grip Europe, leading to unimaginable suffering and injustice. You can almost hear the distant murmur of whispers, growing louder, more insistent, as the shadows lengthen. This quiet, creeping dread is the true beginning of our story. Long before the first trials, long before the first accusations became a death sentence. It's the story of how fear, given enough time and fertile ground, can twist even the most innocent beliefs into something truly monstrous. Remember those whispers of witches flying on broomsticks or secret meetings with demons that you heard in part 1? For centuries, these stories were considered fairy tales, the delusions of superstitious peasants. But then, like a storm approaching, attitudes began to change. The Inquisition, founded in the 12th and 13th centuries, was originally focused on stamping out heretical movements within Christianity, such as Catharism in southern France. Their goal was to protect the purity of the faith, to make sure you and your neighbors didn't stray from the orthodox path. It's a well-known historical fact the Inquisition wasn't created to hunt witches. It was created to hunt heretics. They cared more about what you believed than what you did, unless what you did went against what you were supposed to believe. However, as the concept of dark magic and pacts with the devil began to take root in the minds of theologians and laypeople, the line between heresy and witchcraft began to blur. If you believed that a woman could cause illness with a spell, was it still a harmless superstition? Or was it evidence of a connection to evil? The Inquisition, with its established structure and investigative procedures, was the perfect tool to deal with this new threat. You can feel a chill run down your spine when you realize how easily a system designed for one purpose could be repurposed for another, like a sharp kitchen knife. It could be used to cut vegetables, but it could also be used for much more sinister things. A little-known detail is the early involvement of secular courts in cases involving witchcraft. Before the Inquisition really got involved, many witchcraft cases were tried in local courts, which often focused on actual harm, such as infecting livestock or destroying crops, rather than pacts with the devil. This suggests that the concept of witchcraft existed at a local level before it was taken over by theologians and the Inquisition, and turned into a global, demonic threat. You can imagine a neighbor complaining to the local judge that their apple tree wasn't producing fruit because some old woman had looked at it. It was a small village issue, not yet a war against Satan, but then a terrifying change took place. Papal bulls, most notably Pope Innocent VIII's Summis Desiderantes Affectibus in 1484, officially linked witchcraft to heresy and gave Inquisition investigators greater power to prosecute alleged witches. The bull was more than just a legal document. It was a powerful statement, an official authorization to hunt down and punish those deemed to be agents of the devil. You could feel the weight of those words echoing through the corridors of power, finally falling on small villages and vulnerable individuals. It was like a sign of permission, a green light for a hunt that had previously been sporadic. With the support of the Pope, the Inquisition began to expand its reach. They brought with them a tried-and-true, terrifying system for investigating, torturing, and convicting. You can imagine an Inquisition investigator coming to your village, not as a friendly stranger, but as a specter of power, carrying a thick book and a cold gaze. They weren't just looking for those who had strayed from the faith. They were looking for those who had sold their souls to the devil, those who were believed to be harming the community from within. The Inquisition's process was significantly different from the conventional secular legal systems you might be familiar with. In secular courts, you were generally considered innocent until proven guilty. But in the Inquisition, especially as the witch hunts intensified, the burden of proof often fell on the accused. Once you were suspected, you were in an extremely dangerous position. Every word, every action can be misinterpreted, twisted into evidence against you. You may find yourself arrested, taken to a cold, damp prison. No lawyer, yet no right to confront your accuser. Instead, you will face investigators who are convinced of your guilt before they even start asking questions. They are not looking for the truth. They are looking for a confession. And to get that confession, they are willing to use methods that you will find horrifying. Historians still debate whether the Inquisition actually motivated the witch hunts or was simply one of many factors that contributed to them. Some argue that the involvement of the Inquisition made the hunts more systematic and brutal, while others argue that secular courts and mass panic were the main drivers. It's a complicated question, like trying to figure out which straw broke the camel's back. Was the Inquisition the fire, or was it just fuel added to an already burning fire? Meanwhile, the use of torture became an integral part of the Inquisition's process. You shudder to think about the tools used to break a person's will. Confessions under torture were not necessarily reliable confessions, but in this context, they were considered irrefutable evidence of guilt. You would be pushed to the limit of your endurance, forced to say what the inquisitors wanted to hear, even if it meant incriminating yourself and others. This led to a vicious cycle. Once a person had been tortured and confessed, they were often forced to name other accomplices. You can imagine the horror of having to choose between continuing to endure unspeakable pain or giving out names, knowing that you were condemning other innocent people to the same fate. It was a choice no one wanted to face, a terrible truth about human nature when pushed to the brink. The involvement of the Inquisition brought a level of formality and systematization to witch hunts that had not existed before. They did not rely solely on rumors and accusations. They brought with them a theological and legal framework to justify their actions. This meant that the hunts were no longer isolated. Localized incidents, they could spread, crossing village and regional boundaries, becoming a broader movement. Fueled by fear and fanaticism, you may see your neighbors, the people you grew up with, begin to look at each other with suspicion. Trust is eroded. A small lie, a misunderstanding. A slight difference in behavior can be enough to land a person in the sights of the Inquisition. You may see an elderly woman, living alone, with strange habits, suddenly become a target. Or a man with knowledge of herbs, seen as practicing dark magic. The shadow of the Inquisition has loomed over Europe, transforming the fear of witches from a local superstition into a global threat, backed by the power of the Church. You can feel the cold of iron, the pain of bones, and the desperation of a forced confession. This is not just a story about witches. This is a story about power, about fear, and about how a system can be bent to justify brutality. It's like a nightmare you can't wake up from, where everyone is a potential suspect and every shadow holds a threat. You find yourself now standing at the very precipice of the storm. As the scattered anxieties and theological musings we've discussed begin to coalesce into something truly terrifying, a codified, systematic blueprint for terror. Imagine a world plunged into darkness, and then a single, flickering lantern appears. But instead of offering solace, it illuminates the path to your destruction. This is the moment the Malleus Maleficarum Latin for the witch's hammer enters the scene. It wasn't just a book, it was a weapon, forged in fear and wielded with devastating precision. You might have heard whispers of it, perhaps from a traveling merchant or a grim-faced inquisitor passing through your village. Published in 1487, this tome was the brainchild of two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. Though Sprenger's exact contribution is debated by modern scholars, some historians still debate whether Sprenger was truly a co-author, or if Kramer simply added his name for legitimacy. It was Kramer, a man of fervent conviction and relentless zeal, who was the driving force behind its creation. He had encountered resistance in his own witch trials, facing skepticism from local authorities and even some church officials who still clung to the older, more dismissive views on witchcraft. Kramer saw the Malleus as his answer, a definitive guide to convince the doubters and arm the persecutors. It was a common historical fact that this book became the most influential text for witch hunters for centuries. It was basically the witch hunting for dummies guide, except it was anything but dummy-proof. It was designed to make sure no one was safe. The book itself is a sprawling, dense, and utterly chilling read. It's divided into 3 parts, each meticulously designed to dismantle any argument against the existence of witches and to provide a comprehensive framework for their identification, prosecution, and condemnation. You can almost feel the cold logic seeping from its pages, a logic twisted by paranoia and misogyny. The first part of the Malleus is dedicated to proving the very existence of witches and the reality of their pact with the devil. It systematically refutes the long-standing theological arguments that dismissed witchcraft as mere delusion. Kramer and Sprenger argued that denying the existence of witches was heresy in itself, because it denied the power of the devil. They posited that witches were not merely deluded individuals. They were active agents of Satan, capable of performing genuine maleficium, harmful magic. You might have scoffed at the idea of a neighbor flying through the air on a broomstick, but the Malleus would have explained in excruciating detail how the devil could transport them or create the illusion of flight, making any such denial a dangerous act of skepticism. It was like saying, "Oh, you don't believe in ghosts." Well, that's exactly what a ghost wants you to think. This section also delves into the various ways witches supposedly harmed others, causing impotence, blighting crops, killing livestock, inducing illness, and even sacrificing unbaptized infants. Every misfortune, every unexplained ailment in your life could suddenly be attributed to the malevolent will of a witch. You might have woken up one morning to find your cow had fallen ill, and instead of blaming a common disease, the Malleus would have given you a ready-made explanation. A witch, lurking in the shadows, had cast a spell. It was a convenient scapegoat for a world struggling with hardship and lacking scientific understanding. The second part of the Malleus is where things get truly disturbing. This is the practical handbook, the how-to guide for witch hunters. It details the methods by which witches can be identified and, crucially, how they can be brought to confession. This section outlines the various signs of witchcraft, from physical marks like moles or birthmarks, which could be interpreted as the devil's mark, to unusual behavior or even just a bad reputation. You might have had a peculiar birthmark on your arm your whole life, something you never thought twice about. But under the scrutiny of the Malleus, it could suddenly become a damning piece of evidence. It was a terrifying thought, that your very body could betray you. This part also meticulously describes the legal procedures for conducting a witch trial. It advises on how to handle accusations, how to gather evidence often through rumor and hearsay, and how to conduct interrogations. And here's where the true horror lies. The Malleus explicitly endorses and details the use of torture to extract confessions. It provides justifications for torture, arguing that witches, being agents of the devil, would not confess willingly and thus required extreme measures. You can almost hear the creak of the rack, the chilling drip of water from the strappado, as the book calmly explains how to apply pressure, how to inflict pain, until the accused breaks and confesses to anything, real or imagined. It even offers advice on how to interpret confessions made under duress, claiming that even if a confession was later recanted, it was still valid because the devil could influence the accused to lie. Talk about a rigged game, right? It was like a game of heads I win, tails you lose, but with much higher stakes than a coin toss. One unique and particularly insidious detail in the Malleus is its advice on how to deal with the silence of the accused. If a suspected witch remained silent during interrogation, the book suggested that this was proof of their demonic pact, as the devil was believed to prevent them from speaking. This meant that silence was interpreted as guilt, just as a confession was. There was no escape. Every action, every non-action, could be twisted into evidence against you. It was a truly diabolical catch-22 designed to ensure conviction. The third part of the Malleus focuses on the various methods for exorcising demons and preventing witchcraft, as well as the sentencing of convicted witches. It discusses how to deal with those who confess, those who remain defiant, and the ultimate punishment, execution, usually by burning. The book argues that burning was the most appropriate punishment because it purified the soul through fire and prevented the witch's body from being used for further evil by the devil. You can almost feel the heat of the pyre, the acrid smell of smoke, as the book calmly lays out the final brutal act of this terrifying drama. Perhaps the most infamous and disturbing aspect of the Malleus Maleficarum is its virulent misogyny. The book explicitly states that women are far more susceptible to the devil's temptations than men, and therefore the vast majority of witches are female. It cites various reasons for this. Drawing on ancient prejudices and misinterpretations of Scripture, women are weaker in mind and body, more carnal, more prone to lust, more impressionable, and more talkative, and thus more likely to spread evil. You, as a woman living in this era, would have found yourself under an immediate cloud of suspicion simply by virtue of your gender. Your natural curiosity, your emotional depth, your very being could be twisted into a sign of your inherent wickedness. It was like saying, "Oh, you like to talk clearly. You're conspiring with demons." It was a truly unfair stereotype, even by the standards of the time. The Malleus dedicated entire sections to explaining why women were more prone to witchcraft, using convoluted theological arguments and anecdotal evidence. It painted a picture of women as inherently flawed, easily led astray, and thus perfect vessels for the devil's work. This wasn't just casual sexism, it was a systematic theological justification for persecuting women. It's a chilling reminder of how easily prejudice can be cloaked in the guise of religious doctrine. The impact of the Malleus Maleficarum was immediate and profound. Despite some initial resistance and skepticism, it quickly gained widespread acceptance, particularly among secular judges and local authorities, who were eager for a clear guide on how to deal with the perceived threat of witchcraft. The book went through numerous editions and translations, spreading its horrifying doctrines across Europe. You can imagine it being passed from hand to hand, a forbidden yet compelling text, its words shaping the fears and actions of entire communities. It became the authoritative text, the go-to manual for anyone involved in a witch trial. From the lowliest village magistrate to the highest inquisitor, it provided a framework, a set of rules, and a justification for actions that might otherwise have seemed barbaric. It gave legitimacy to accusations, even the most outlandish ones, and it streamlined the process of conviction. Before the Malleus, witch trials were often sporadic and localized. After its publication, they became more frequent, more systematic, and far more deadly. You might have seen its influence in the sudden efficiency with which accusations were handled, the chilling speed with which trials progressed, and the increasing number of executions. Historians still debate the precise extent to which the Malleus Maleficarum directly caused the witch hunts, or if it merely reflected and amplified existing fears and prejudices. Some argue it was the primary catalyst, providing the intellectual and procedural tools that fueled the craze. Others suggest it was more a symptom of a broader societal panic, a book that gave voice to anxieties already present. Regardless, its influence is undeniable. It codified the demonological theories that underpinned the hunts and provided a chillingly practical guide for their execution. It's like arguing whether a match caused a wildfire or just helped it spread. Either way, the fire raged. You can almost feel the weight of this book. Its pages filled with fear and condemnation, pressing down on the lives of ordinary people. It turned suspicion into certainty, fear into action, and difference into damnation. It was a dark mirror reflecting the deepest anxieties of a society grappling with plague, famine, and religious upheaval. The Malleus Maleficarum didn't just describe the awful truth about witch hunts, it helped create it, turning a terrifying belief into a horrifying reality for countless innocent individuals. As you drift deeper into this historical nightmare, remember the power of a single book, a single idea, to unleash such widespread destruction. The hammer had fallen, and its echoes would reverberate through centuries. You've seen the terrifying blueprint laid out in the Malleus Maleficarum, a chilling instruction manual for a dark age. Now, let's shift our gaze from the theoretical to the agonizingly real. Imagine yourself back in that small, isolated village, the one where every shadow seems to hold a secret, and every whisper can carry the weight of a death sentence. The Malleus provided the justification and the method, but the spark that ignited the actual fires of persecution often came from much closer to home, from the insidious creep of whispers and the venomous sting of accusations. You wake to the sound of roosters crowing, a familiar comfort. Yet today it feels different. There's a tension in the air, a hushed urgency in the voices you hear outside your window. Someone is being accused. And once that first accusation is voiced, it's like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples that spread wider and wider, eventually engulfing everything in their path. This is where the awful truth truly begins to bite, as suspicion, fueled by fear and amplified by the new doctrines, turns neighbor against neighbor. A common historical fact is that the vast majority of witch accusations did not originate from grand inquisitors or learned theologians, but from ordinary people within the community. These were your neighbors, your friends, perhaps even your relatives. The accusations often stemmed from petty quarrels, long-standing feuds, or simple misunderstandings. Maybe you had a disagreement over a boundary line with old Agnes, or perhaps young Thomas felt slighted when you didn't offer him a share of your harvest. These small grievances, once dealt with through arguments or a cold shoulder, now had a terrifying new outlet. If your cow suddenly fell ill after a spat with Agnes, it wasn't just bad luck, it was maleficium, a harmful spell. And Agnes became a prime suspect. It was like the ultimate "I told you so," but with much more dire consequences than a simple eye roll. You see, in a world where misfortune was rampant and scientific understanding was scarce, people desperately sought explanations for the inexplicable. Why did the crops fail this year? Why did the baby sicken and die? Why did the milk curdle in your modern world? You'd consult a doctor, an agronomist, or maybe a dairy expert. But in this era, with the malleus circulating and sermons thundering about the devil's agents, the answer often pointed to a witch. It was a convenient, albeit terrifying, way to make sense of a chaotic and often brutal existence. If only they had known about pasteurization, a lot of people might have been spared. The accusations often began subtly. A rumor here, a pointed finger there. Someone might mention, "Did you notice how quickly old Alara's garden withered after she argued with the miller's wife?" Or, "My child started coughing terribly right after that strange woman looked at him?" These weren't direct accusations of witchcraft yet, but they were the fertile ground from which such accusations would sprout. You'd hear these whispers at the market, by the well, in the churchyard. They'd spread like wildfire, carried on the breath of fearful villagers, until a vague suspicion hardened into a chilling certainty. Who were the typical targets of these initial whispers? Often, they were individuals who already stood out or were marginalized in some way. The elderly, especially women living alone, were particularly vulnerable. Perhaps they were widows with no male protectors, or women who had never married and thus didn't fit neatly into the societal structure. Their eccentricities, their reclusive habits, their knowledge of traditional remedies, all could be twisted into signs of dark dealings. You might have seen the village outcast, the one who mumbled to herself or collected strange herbs, suddenly become the focus of intense, fearful scrutiny. It was a sad truth that those who were already on the fringes were the easiest to push over the edge. The poor were also frequent targets. If you had nothing, and then suddenly a neighbor's fortunes declined, it was easier to accuse you of using dark magic to steal their prosperity than to admit that perhaps the harvest was just bad, or they had made poor decisions. It was a way to explain away economic hardship without having to confront the harsh realities of poverty itself. And then there were the healers, the cunning folk, the wise women and men who had once been respected for their knowledge of herbs and their ability to offer comfort. As the concept of diabolical witchcraft took hold, their practices, once seen as benign, were now viewed with deep suspicion. Their ability to heal could be reinterpreted as an ability to harm, their knowledge of nature as a pact with unnatural forces. You might have gone to the local wise woman for a headache remedy last week. And this week, you're hearing whispers that she's summoning demons. Talk about a career change for the worse. You are entering a time when fear is no longer a vague feeling. It has become a tool, sharpened and wielded by those in power. As you drift off to sleep, you can feel a change in the air, a heaviness, a sense that an invisible net is tightening. Once the seeds of fear and superstition have been sown, they begin to germinate in a carefully prepared environment, the legal and religious systems of Europe. This is when the Inquisition, an institution originally set up to combat other threats, begins to turn its terrifying attention. A unique and particularly disturbing detail from this period is the role that children sometimes played as accusers. While often influenced by adults or even coerced, there are documented cases where children, sometimes claiming to be afflicted by witchcraft, would point fingers at specific individuals. Their testimony, often seen as pure and untainted, carried immense weight in the eyes of the authorities. Imagine a child, perhaps genuinely ill or simply imaginative, describing strange visions or torments, and then naming an elderly neighbor as their tormentor, The impact on the community and on the accused would have been devastating. It was a weaponization of innocence, a truly chilling aspect of the witch hunts. Hey guys, tonight we're taking a deep, slow dive into one of history's most chilling chapters, the awful truth about witch hunts in Europe. Imagine, if you will, the flickering light of a single candle, casting long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls of a medieval cottage. Outside, the wind howls a mournful tune, rattling the shutters, and every creak of the ancient timbers sounds like a whisper from the darkness. You're bundled in rough wool, the scent of wood smoke clinging to your clothes, and the world outside is a vast, untamed wilderness where unseen forces are believed to hold sway. This isn't just a story. It's a journey back to a time when fear was a tangible entity, when suspicion could ignite a blaze that consumed entire communities. And frankly, you probably wouldn't survive a week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Once an accusation was made, even informally, the spiral began. The accused would often be ostracized, their reputation ruined. People would avoid them, fearing contamination or further maleficium. If the accused tried to defend themselves, their protests could be interpreted as further evidence of their guilt, as the devil was believed to make his servants obstinate. You might have seen a person you knew, once a vibrant part of the community, slowly wither under the weight of suspicion, their eyes haunted by the fear of what was to come. You find yourself standing on the precipice of a world far removed from your own, a world where the line between natural phenomena and supernatural intervention is blurred to the point of invisibility. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant, earthy tang of livestock. This isn't the Europe of grand cathedrals and burgeoning universities that you might picture. This is the Europe of small, isolated villages, where life is governed by the rhythm of the seasons, the unpredictable whims of nature, and the ever-present shadow of the unknown. Before the grand, terrifying spectacle of the witch hunts truly began, the seeds of fear and suspicion were already deeply sown, nurtured by centuries of folklore, ancient beliefs, and a profound misunderstanding of the world. The local authorities, whether secular magistrates or ecclesiastical courts, were now under immense pressure to act. The Malleus had given them the tools, and the terrified populace demanded action. The legal procedures were often deeply flawed, designed more to secure a confession than to ascertain the truth. There was no presumption of innocence. If you were accused, you were already halfway to being condemned. You would be interrogated, often repeatedly, with leading questions designed to elicit admissions of guilt. You see, long before Christianity swept across the continent, the lands you now inhabit were steeped in pagan traditions. People lived in intimate communion with nature, believing in spirits that dwelled in trees, rivers, and stones. They sought guidance from wise women and cunning men, individuals who understood the properties of herbs, the cycles of the moon, and the subtle signs of the natural world. These were often the healers, the diviners, the ones who offered comfort and practical solutions in a harsh existence. They might have brewed a poultice for your aching back, or offered a charm to protect your harvest from blight. It was a world where magic wasn't inherently evil, it was simply another force, like the wind or the rain, to be understood and, if possible, harnessed. You might even have sought out their services yourself, perhaps for a love potion. Though, let's be honest, those rarely worked out as planned. Did they? It was less about casting spells and more about knowing which root to chew for a fever, or how to interpret the flight of birds for a good omen. The concept of spectral evidence also played a terrifying role, particularly in some of the later hunts, like the infamous Salem witch trials, though those were in a different context. The underlying principle was similar. This was testimony about dreams or visions of the accused spirit tormenting the accuser. You could be accused based on someone else's nightmare imagined being told. I saw your spirit choking me in my sleep last night, therefore you are a witch. It was an impossible defense, a truly Kafkaesque situation where your very thoughts, or someone else's thoughts about you, could condemn you, As Christianity gradually spread, it encountered these deeply entrenched beliefs. Initially, the church's stance on what we now call witchcraft was surprisingly nuanced, even dismissive. For centuries, the prevailing theological view, often referred to as the canon episcopi, held that belief in witches who flew through the night, consorted with demons, or transformed into animals was largely a delusion, a pagan superstition. You, as a newly converted peasant, might have been gently chastised for still believing in the old ways, but you wouldn't have been burned at the stake for it. The church's primary concern was heresy, deviations from Christian doctrine, not so much the village wise woman who helped deliver babies. It was a common historical fact that for a long time, the official church position was that witchcraft was more of a pagan delusion than a real diabolical threat. They were more worried about you questioning the Trinity than you trying to turn your neighbor into a newt. As the accusations mounted, the hysteria could snowball. One confession, particularly if extracted under torture, would often lead to the naming of other accomplices. The accused, desperate to end their suffering, would often invent names, sometimes pointing to people they had grudges against, or simply naming individuals they knew were already unpopular or vulnerable. You can imagine the terror being tortured, broken, and then forced to condemn others, knowing that your words, however false, would seal their fate. It was a horrifying chain reaction, each link forged in pain and fear. But as the centuries turned, something began to shift. The world grew more complex, more uncertain. Plagues swept through the land, decimating populations. Famines gnawed at the bellies of the poor. Wars raged, tearing apart the social fabric. In the face of such overwhelming suffering and inexplicable misfortune, people desperately sought explanations. And as the church consolidated its power, its understanding of evil evolved. The old pagan deities once revered were slowly recast as demons. The ancient rituals, once harmless, became sinister pacts with the devil. It was a subtle, insidious transformation, like watching a friendly shadow stretch and contort into something monstrous in the fading light. Historians still debate whether the accusations were primarily driven by genuine belief in witchcraft, or if they were often used as a convenient tool to settle scores, eliminate rivals, or seize property. Was it true religious fervor, or thinly veiled opportunism? It's a complex web of motivations, isn't it? You might have seen a wealthy widow accused, and then her property conveniently confiscated, making you wonder about the true motives behind the accusations. It's like trying to figure out if someone is genuinely upset or just looking for an excuse to get out of doing chores. You begin to notice the change in the hushed whispers around the communal well. The wise woman, once respected, is now eyed with suspicion. Her knowledge of herbs, once a blessing, is now seen as a potential conduit for dark forces. If the crops fail, if a child falls ill, if the cow gives sour milk, the easy explanation shifts from bad luck or divine displeasure to something more tangible, more human, yet utterly supernatural, a malevolent hand at work. This transition, from magic as a natural, if misunderstood, force to magic as a direct act of heresy and a pact with the devil, is a crucial, yet often overlooked, detail. It wasn't a sudden flip of a switch, it was a slow, creeping dread that settled over the land, like a persistent fog. You might have found yourself nervously avoiding the path that led past the old woman's cottage. Just in case, the spiral of accusations was a self-perpetuating cycle. The more people were accused, the more proof there seemed to be that witches were indeed rampant in the community. The more confessions were extracted, the more the authorities felt justified in their actions. And the more executions took place, the more terrified the populace became, leading to even more accusations. You would have felt trapped in a nightmare, watching as your community slowly tore itself apart, consumed by its own fear and suspicion. One particularly fascinating and lesser-known detail from this period involves the early legal codes. While not directly witch hunts as we understand them, some Roman laws, even those predating widespread Christianity, occasionally touched upon harmful magic, not as a religious offense, but as a form of poisoning or maleficium, a harmful act. This demonstrates that the concept of using unseen forces to cause harm existed long before the Christian demonization of witchcraft. It was a practical concern, not yet a theological one. Imagine, you could be accused of using a spell to make your neighbor's chickens lay rotten eggs, and that would be treated more like a petty crime than a spiritual transgression. It's almost quaint, isn't it, compared to what was to come? This period was a stark reminder of how fragile justice can be when fear takes hold. The normal rules of evidence and due process were abandoned in the face of a perceived existential threat. Anyone could be accused, and once accused, escape was nearly impossible. The whispers grew louder, the accusations more frequent, and the shadow of the pyre loomed larger over every village square. You can almost hear the frantic, terrified voices pointing fingers, condemning their neighbors, as the spiral of accusations tightened its grip, pulling everyone down into the awful truth of the witch hunts. As the Middle Ages deepened, the concept of a devil's pact gained significant traction. Theologians and inquisitors, grappling with the nature of evil and the source of misfortune, began to weave a terrifying narrative. They argued that true magic, the kind that genuinely caused harm, could only come from a direct agreement with Satan. This wasn't just about a local spellcaster. This was about a cosmic battle between good and evil. And anyone suspected of witchcraft was, by extension, an agent of the devil, an enemy of God and man. You, as an ordinary person, would have heard sermons filled with vivid descriptions of demonic temptations and the eternal damnation awaiting those who succumbed. The fear was palpable, a cold knot in your stomach. You felt the chilling touch of suspicion, the insidious spread of accusations that can turn a peaceful village into a den of paranoia. But what happens once the accusation has been made? Once the whispers have solidified into a formal charge? This is where the true horror of the witch hunts often manifested, in the cold, unyielding grip of interrogation and the brutal, soul-crushing reality of torture. Imagine yourself stripped of dignity, isolated, and facing individuals convinced of your guilt, armed with tools designed to break your will, not to find the truth. This is the crucible of confession, and few emerged from it unscathed. This evolving theological framework provided the intellectual justification for what would become a widespread persecution. The very idea of a witch transformed from a benign, if superstitious, figure into a dangerous heretic, a conspirator against humanity. The shift was subtle, but its consequences were catastrophic. It's like the difference between someone believing in lucky charms and someone believing their neighbor is actively trying to curse them with a demonic ritual. One is harmless, the other leads to bonfires. You are led, perhaps in the dead of night, from your humble home to a dark, damp cell. The air is heavy with the smell of mildew and fear. The silence is broken only by the drip of water from the stone ceiling, each drop echoing the relentless passage of time. You are alone, utterly alone, with only your racing thoughts for company. This isolation is the first step in breaking you down, designed to make you feel utterly helpless and dependent on your interrogators. You might try to recall the faces of your loved ones, to hold on to some semblance of reality, but even those memories begin to blur in the oppressive darkness. Historians still debate whether the popular beliefs in folk magic genuinely morphed into the concept of diabolical witchcraft, or if the theological elite simply imposed their own interpretations onto existing superstitions. Was it a top-down imposition of fear, or a bottom-up evolution of existing anxieties? It's a chicken and egg question, isn't it? Did the common folk really believe their neighbor was flying on a broomstick to a satanic sabbat, or were they just told to believe it by those in power? The truth, as always, is probably a messy combination of both. You can almost feel the intellectual currents shifting, the slow, grinding gears of theological thought turning, producing a terrifying new reality. A common historical fact is that torture was, while not universally applied in every witch trial, became an increasingly prevalent and accepted method for extracting confessions, particularly in the peak periods of the witch hunts. It wasn't a secret, shameful practice. It was often a legally sanctioned procedure, justified by the belief that witches, being in league with the devil, would not confess willingly through ordinary means. The logic was twisted, but it was logic nonetheless. They believed the devil gave his servants supernatural strength to resist pain, So only extreme measures could overcome this demonic fortitude. It was like trying to get a stubborn stain out of a shirt. But instead of using soap, they decided to use a sledgehammer. Your interrogators, typically a magistrate, an inquisitor, or a panel of local officials, would approach you not as an innocent person to be questioned, but as a guilty party whose confession was merely a formality. Their goal wasn't to determine if you were a witch, it was to make you admit that you were. They would begin with lengthy, often repetitive interrogations, asking about your life, your neighbors, your beliefs. They would twist your words, find sinister meanings in innocent statements, and present evidence that was often nothing more than hearsay or spectral visions. You might innocently mention that you once wished your neighbor's chickens would stop squawking, and they would interpret it as a confession to cursing their flock. Then, the psychological torment would begin. Sleep deprivation, starvation, constant questioning, and the chilling threat of what was to come. You might be shown the instruments of torture, laid out on a table, gleaming dully in the candlelight. The rack, the strappado, thumbscrews, leg vices, each one a promise of unimaginable pain. The mere sight of these devices and the knowledge of what they could do was often enough to break a person's spirit before a single drop of blood was shed. You'd feel a cold knot of dread tighten in your stomach, your breath catching in your throat. When the psychological methods failed or were deemed insufficient, the physical torture would commence. The Malleus Maleficarum provided explicit instructions and justifications for these methods, ensuring that interrogators felt they were acting within God's will. The strappado was a common method. Your hands would be tied behind your back, and you would be hoisted into the air by a rope, often with weights attached to your feet, dislocating your shoulders. The pain would be excruciating, a searing agony that would course through your entire body. You would scream, beg, plead, but the interrogators would remain impassive, urging you to confess, to name your accomplices, to reveal the details of your pact with the devil. Another horrifying device was the rack, which stretched your body, slowly dislocating joints and tearing muscles, or the thumbscrews, which crushed your fingers, making even the simplest touch unbearable. You might have tried to remain silent, to resist, but the pain would be relentless, overwhelming, stripping away your identity piece by piece until all that remained was the primal urge to make it stop. It was a descent into a hellish landscape where your body became your enemy, betraying you with every spasm of agony. A unique and particularly cruel detail of some torture practices was the witch's bridle or skull's bridle. This was an iron muzzle that fit over the head, with a sharp spike that pressed down on the tongue, preventing the accused from speaking or even crying out. It was designed not just to inflict pain, but to silence, to strip away the last vestiges of human expression. Imagine the terror of being unable to scream, to articulate your innocence, while your body was subjected to unimaginable torment. It was a horrifying symbol of the complete control the persecutors sought to exert over their victims. The goal of torture was always the same: confession. And once a confession was extracted, it was considered irrefutable proof of guilt. It didn't matter if you later recanted, claiming your confession was made under duress. The Malleus and other legal texts of the time often argued that a recantation was merely the devil reasserting his influence over you. So, you were trapped to confess under torture and be condemned. Or refuse to confess and be tortured until you did. Or until you died. It was a no-win situation, a truly horrifying paradox. The confessions themselves were often fantastical, filled with details that were clearly the product of the interrogators' leading questions and the accused's desperate attempts to appease them. You might have confessed to flying to a sabbat on a broomstick, meeting the devil in the form of a black cat, or engaging in grotesque rituals, simply because those were the narratives your tormentors expected to hear. These confessions, however absurd, were then used to justify further accusations, creating that horrifying spiral we discussed in the previous chapter. You can almost hear the broken whispers, inventing stories, weaving tales of dark magic, just to make the pain stop. Historians still debate the effectiveness and true purpose of torture in the witch trials. Was it genuinely believed to be a tool for uncovering truth? Or was it primarily a means of reinforcing the existing belief system and eliminating perceived threats? Some argue that the interrogators genuinely believed they were fighting evil, and that torture was a necessary evil to save souls. Others contend that it was a brutal, cynical method to secure convictions and maintain social order in turbulent times. It's a dark mirror held up to human nature, isn't it? What happens when fear and conviction combine with unchecked power? The impact of torture extended far beyond the physical pain. It shattered minds, destroyed reputations, and tore apart families. Even if you survived the ordeal, you would be forever marked a pariah in your community, haunted by the memories of what you endured and what you were forced to say. The psychological scars would run deep, far deeper than any physical wounds. You would carry the weight of false accusations, forced confessions, and the knowledge that your own words had condemned others. As the witch hunts intensified, the use of torture became more widespread, more systematic. It was a terrifying testament to the power of fear and the willingness of authorities to resort to extreme measures in the face of perceived existential threats. The screams from the torture chambers echoed through the night, a chilling soundtrack to one of history's darkest chapters. You can almost feel the cold dread, the crushing weight of despair, as you imagine yourself in that crucible of confession, where innocence was irrelevant and survival depended only on your ability to break. It's a stark reminder of the awful truth in those dark times. The very act of seeking truth often created the most profound injustices. You've witnessed the slow, insidious creep of suspicion, the terrifying logic of the Malleus Maleficarum, and the brutal reality of the torture chamber. But to truly understand the awful truth about the witch hunts, you must pull back and see the broader tapestry of European society in the early modern period. These weren't isolated incidents of madness. They were symptoms of a deeply troubled world, where societal tensions, economic anxieties, and religious upheaval created a volatile environment, perfectly primed to ignite the flames of persecution. Imagine yourself living in a time of profound uncertainty. The world you inhabit is not stable. It's a swirling vortex of change and crisis. This is a common historical fact, the peak period of the witch hunts. Roughly from 1450 to 1750 coincided with a series of immense societal pressures across Europe. These pressures didn't directly cause the witch hunts, but they acted as powerful accelerants, turning isolated sparks of fear into raging infernos. It was like living in a house built on a fault line, where any tremor could bring the whole thing crashing down. One of the most significant factors was the series of devastating climate changes, often referred to as the Little Ice Age. You might picture long, harsh winters, late springs, and cold, wet summers. These conditions led to widespread crop failures, famines, and a general decline in agricultural productivity. You'd feel the gnawing pangs of hunger in your own belly, see your children growing thin, and watch your neighbors struggle to survive. When the harvest failed year after year and starvation loomed, people desperately sought explanations beyond the unpredictable whims of nature. It was easier to blame a malevolent force, a witch, than to accept the crushing reality of a changing climate. It's a bit like blaming your internet provider for a bad hair day, but with far more severe consequences. Concurrent with these environmental challenges were waves of disease. While the Black Death had ravaged Europe centuries earlier, subsequent outbreaks of plague, typhus, and other illnesses continued to decimate populations. You'd see your loved ones fall ill, their bodies racked with fever, their lives slipping away, and you'd be powerless to stop it. Without modern medicine, the cause of such widespread suffering was a terrifying mystery. Again, the witch offered a convenient, albeit terrifying, explanation. If a whole village succumbed to a mysterious illness, it wasn't just bad luck, it was the work of a witch, poisoning the wells or casting a curse. This fear of contagion, combined with a lack of understanding of disease, created a fertile ground for paranoia. Then there was the profound religious upheaval of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. Europe was tearing itself apart over matters of faith. Catholics battled Protestants, and within each denomination, various factions vied for dominance. You'd find yourself caught between warring theological doctrines, with each side convinced of its own righteousness and seeing the other as agents of the devil. This intense religious fervor, this heightened sense of a cosmic battle between good and evil, fueled the belief in a literal devil and his earthly servants. If God was on one side, then the devil must be actively working through his minions on the other. You might have seen your own community divided. families split along religious lines, and this internal strife only intensified the search for internal enemies. The witches. A unique and often overlooked detail is the role of the legal system's evolution. As central governments and legal systems became more formalized and powerful, they also sought to assert their authority over local affairs. Witchcraft, being a crime against both God and the state, provided a convenient way for these burgeoning legal systems to demonstrate their power and solidify their control. The trials, while horrifying, were also a display of state authority, a way to impose order and uniformity in a chaotic world. It's like a new boss coming in and making an example of someone to show everyone who's in charge. The economic landscape was also shifting dramatically. The rise of early capitalism, the growth of towns, and changing agricultural practices led to increased social mobility, but also increased inequality. You might have seen some individuals prosper while others fell into destitution. This created resentment, envy, and a sense of social dislocation. When traditional communal bonds weakened and competition increased, it became easier to view your struggling neighbor not with sympathy, but with suspicion, especially if they seemed to be doing better than you, or if you felt they had wronged you in some way. The witch accusation became a tool to explain away economic misfortune, or to settle economic grievances. Consider the example of land disputes. In agrarian societies, land was everything. If your crops failed and your neighbors thrived, or if a boundary marker was moved, it could lead to bitter disputes. In such a climate, accusing a neighbor of witchcraft could be a way to gain an advantage, to discredit them, or even to seize their property. While not the primary motivation for all accusations, economic factors certainly played a role in many local cases. It was a way to win an argument without having to actually argue, just by introducing a supernatural element. Historians still debate the relative importance of these various societal tensions in fueling the witch hunts. Was it primarily economic hardship, religious zeal, or social dislocation that drove the persecutions? It's a complex interplay, isn't it? You can't point to one single cause, but rather a confluence of factors that created a perfect storm for paranoia and violence. It's like trying to figure out why a cake tastes good. It's not just the sugar, or the flour, or the eggs. It's the combination of all of them. The fear of the other also played a significant role. In a society that valued conformity and tradition, anyone who deviated from the norm could become a target. This included the mentally ill, the physically disabled, those with unusual beliefs, or simply those who were perceived as outsiders. You might have seen a person with a severe mental illness, whose erratic behavior was misunderstood, suddenly labeled as possessed or a witch. Their suffering was not met with compassion, but with fear and condemnation. The witch hunts, therefore, were not just about a belief in magic. They were a brutal manifestation of a society under immense stress. They provided a release valve for collective anxieties, a way to externalize internal problems and blame them on a tangible, evil enemy. When the crops failed, it wasn't the fault of the weather, it was the witch. When disease struck, it wasn't a lack of hygiene, it was the witch. When religious discord threatened to tear society apart, it was the witch, an agent of the devil, undermining the true faith. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief. However fleeting and misplaced, that would have swept through a village after a suspected witch was arrested or executed. It was a false sense of security, a desperate attempt to regain control in a world that felt increasingly out of control. But for the accused, and for those who loved them, it was the ultimate injustice, a horrifying consequence of a society consumed by its own fears. The witch hunts were a tragic reflection of human vulnerability in the face of overwhelming adversity. They show us how easily fear can be manipulated, how quickly prejudice can take root, and how devastating the consequences can be when a society loses its grip on reason and compassion. As you drift deeper into this historical nightmare, consider how these broader societal tensions, these invisible currents of fear and hardship, created the perfect environment for the awful truth of the witch hunts to unfold. You've journeyed through the dark forests of fear, witnessed the chilling machinery of justice, and felt the crushing weight of societal anxieties. Now, as the shadows lengthen and the story deepens, you must confront one of the most stark and disturbing truths of the European witch hunts. The overwhelming majority of the victims were women. Imagine a mirror held up to society, reflecting its deepest prejudices. And in that reflection, you see the distorted image of womanhood itself, twisted into something demonic and dangerous. This was not merely a persecution, it was a gendered persecution, where being female often placed you squarely in the crosshairs of suspicion. A common historical fact, undeniable and chilling, is that approximately 75% to 85% of all individuals accused and executed for witchcraft in Europe were women. While men were certainly accused and suffered, their numbers pale in comparison. This wasn't a random act of terror, it was a targeted campaign, deeply rooted in the misogynistic beliefs and societal structures of the time. You might wonder why, in a world where misfortune struck everyone, women bore the brunt of this horrifying phenomenon. It's like a game where only one team is allowed to be the villain, and that team is always the women. The reasons for this disproportionate targeting are complex, woven into the very fabric of early modern European society. Firstly, as we briefly touched upon with the Malleus Maleficarum, theological and cultural beliefs about women played a crucial role. The prevailing view, heavily influenced by interpretations of biblical texts and classical philosophy, often portrayed women as inherently weaker, more susceptible to temptation, and more prone to sin than men. Eve's temptation of Adam was frequently cited as proof of female moral frailty. You were taught from a young age that your very nature made you a potential gateway for evil, a vessel easily manipulated by the devil. It was a constant whisper in the back of your mind, a subtle yet pervasive accusation. This inherent weakness was often linked to perceived emotional instability and a greater carnality. Women were believed to be more lustful, more prone to irrationality, and therefore more easily seduced by the devil into a pact. The Malleus explicitly stated that the fair sex was more likely to engage in witchcraft due to their insatiable carnal desires and their natural loquacity tendency to talk a lot, which made them more likely to spread evil. Imagine being told that your natural inclination to chat with your friends made you a prime candidate for a demonic conspiracy. It's a truly absurd, yet tragically effective, piece of propaganda. Beyond theological justifications, the societal roles of women also made them vulnerable. In many communities, women were the primary caregivers, healers, and midwives. They possessed knowledge of herbs, remedies, and the cycles of life and death. While this knowledge was often vital and respected, it could also be easily twisted into something sinister when fear took hold. If a child died during childbirth, or a herbal remedy failed, the midwife or healer, often an older woman, could suddenly be accused of using dark magic rather than simply facing the limitations of pre-modern medicine. You might have seen a respected village elder, who had brought countless babies into the world, suddenly become a pariah after a single tragedy. Furthermore, women often held less power and status in society. They had fewer legal rights, less access to education, and were largely excluded from formal positions of authority. This made them easier targets. They had fewer resources to defend themselves, less influence to counter accusations, and were more likely to be believed guilty by male-dominated courts. If you were a woman, without a powerful husband or male relatives to speak for you, your voice was often silenced, your pleas unheard. It was like trying to win a debate when no one in the room is willing to listen to your side. An interesting and lesser-known detail is the concept of maleficent women in folk tradition, even prior to the full demonization of witchcraft. In many local cultures, there were stories and beliefs about women who could cause harm through curses, the evil eye, or minor magical acts. These were often rooted in local disputes and resentments. When the larger theological framework of diabolical witchcraft was introduced, these existing local beliefs about maleficent women provided a ready-made template for identifying and accusing witches. It was like taking a small, local squabble and suddenly declaring it a global war. The elderly, unmarried, or widowed women were particularly vulnerable. Without a husband or adult sons to protect them, they were often isolated and lacked social support. Their perceived uselessness in a patriarchal society combined with their often eccentric habits, which might simply be a result of loneliness or age, made them easy scapegoats for community misfortunes. You might have seen the old woman who lived on the edge of the village, perhaps a bit reclusive, suddenly become the focus of terrifying accusations after a string of bad luck befell the community. The fear of female sexuality also played a role. In a society that often viewed female sexuality with suspicion and sought to control it, accusations of witchcraft could be a way to punish women who deviated from societal norms, whether they were too outspoken, too independent, or simply perceived as sexually transgressive. The idea of witches engaging in orgiastic sabbats with the devil was a common trope in confessions, often extracted under torture, reflecting these deep-seated anxieties about female sexuality. It was a twisted form of social control, wasn't it? Historians still debate the extent to which the witch hunts were a deliberate attempt to control women, or simply a reflection of existing misogyny amplified by other societal pressures. Was it a conscious patriarchal conspiracy, or an unconscious byproduct of a deeply unequal society? It's a complex question, like trying to untangle a knot of threads that have been intertwined for centuries. The truth likely lies in a combination of both, where existing biases found fertile ground in a time of crisis. The gendered nature of the witch hunts is a stark reminder of how prejudice can manifest in terrifying ways, especially when combined with fear and unchecked power. It highlights the vulnerability of marginalized groups and the devastating consequences of demonizing an entire segment of the population. The cries of the accused women, their pleas for innocence, often fell on deaf ears, drowned out by the roar of collective hysteria and the rigid doctrines of the time. As you reflect on this awful truth, consider the courage it must have taken for these women to face such accusations, often alone, against the full might of their community and the state. Their stories are a testament to the enduring power of prejudice and the critical importance of challenging harmful stereotypes. The shadows of those burning pyres, overwhelmingly lit for women, serve as a chilling warning from history, reminding us to always question the narratives that seek to demonize and control. You've witnessed the terrifying crescendo of the witch hunts, the peak of their fury where fear reigned supreme and the pyres burned brightest. But even the most intense fires eventually begin to wane, their flames flickering before finally dying out. Now, as you drift deeper into the quietude of history, you'll observe the slow, often uneven, retreat of this madness. It wasn't a sudden awakening, a grand epiphany that swept across Europe. Rather, it was a gradual process, a series of subtle shifts in thought, law, and societal priorities that eventually brought the hunts to a halt. Imagine the collective exhaustion that must have settled over communities. The constant fear, the endless accusations, the economic drain of trials and executions. It took its toll. People grew weary of the bloodshed, weary of the suspicion that tore their communities apart. This weariness, coupled with a growing skepticism from certain influential quarters, marked the beginning of the end. A common historical fact is that the peak of the witch hunts was in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, after which the intensity and frequency of trials began to decline significantly, though pockets of intense persecution persisted well into the 18th century. It was like a fever that slowly, reluctantly began to break. One of the most significant factors in the decline was the rise of rational thought and the Enlightenment. As the 17th century progressed into the 18th, new intellectual currents began to challenge the very foundations of the witch craze. Thinkers like John Locke, Voltaire, and later Cesare Beccaria emphasized reason, empirical evidence, and individual rights. You might have seen learned treatises circulating, not about the reality of the devil's pact, but about the importance of due process and the dangers of superstition. These ideas, while slow to filter down to every village, gradually began to influence legal professionals, judges, and even some theologians. It was like someone finally turning on a dim light in a very dark room, allowing people to see the shadows for what they truly were. The legal system itself began to change. The widespread use of torture, which we discussed in Chapter 5, increasingly came under scrutiny. Lawyers and judges, particularly those trained in Roman law, began to question the reliability of confessions extracted under duress. They realized that innocent people, desperate to escape unimaginable pain, would confess to anything, even the most absurd accusations. You might have heard a judge, perhaps a man of conscience, express his growing unease with the fantastical nature of the confessions, wondering how a person could fly to a Sabbath and be back in their cell by morning. This growing skepticism about torture's efficacy in revealing truth rather than simply producing desired outcomes was a crucial turning point. A unique and particularly effective detail in the decline of the hunts was the financial burden they placed on communities. Witch trials were incredibly expensive. They involved the arrest, imprisonment, interrogation, and often the execution of the accused. Lawyers, judges, jailers, executioners, all had to be paid. Confiscated property rarely covered these costs, and sometimes the accused were even forced to pay for their own torture and execution. You can imagine a local council meeting, not discussing the devil, but the mounting debts from the latest witch trials. Another trial, another empty treasury. You might hear a frustrated councilman exclaim, "This economic reality, rather than a sudden burst of enlightenment, often provided a very practical reason to slow down the prosecutions." It's a bit like realizing that your expensive hobby is bankrupting you, and suddenly it doesn't seem so fun anymore. Furthermore, the very nature of the accusations became problematic. As more and more people were accused, and as confessions under torture led to the naming of ever wider circles of accomplices, the sheer scale of the alleged conspiracy began to strain credulity. If everyone was a witch, who was left to accuse? The logical conclusion of such widespread accusations was societal collapse. And authorities, realizing this, began to impose stricter rules on evidence and procedure. The burden of proof began to shift back towards the accusers, and the fantastical, spectral evidence that had condemned so many became increasingly inadmissible in court. There were also brave individuals who spoke out against the hunts, often at great personal risk. Figures like Johann Weyer, a German physician, argued as early as the mid-16th century that many accused witches were mentally ill, not in league with the devil. Later, Friedrich Spey, a Jesuit priest who had served as a confessor to accused witches, wrote Caudio Criminalis in 1631, a powerful critique of the trials, arguing that torture was unreliable and that no one could escape conviction if subjected to it. You might have seen a copy of Spey's book, perhaps smuggled into your village, its words offering a glimmer of hope amidst the despair. These dissenting voices, though initially marginalized, slowly gained traction, chipping away at the edifice of fear. Historians still debate whether the decline of the witch hunts was primarily due to the rise of Enlightenment rationalism, the practical and economic cost, or the internal contradictions and excesses of the trials themselves. Was it a triumph of reason, a pragmatic retreat, or a combination of both? It's a fascinating puzzle, isn't it? The truth is likely a messy blend, with different factors playing a more dominant role in different regions. The centralization of legal authority also contributed. As power shifted from local, often panicked, courts to higher and more professionalized courts, there was a greater emphasis on legal formality and a more cautious approach to capital punishment. Appeals to higher courts became more common, and these courts were often more reluctant to confirm convictions based on dubious evidence or confessions extracted under torture. You might have heard whispers of a case being overturned by a distant, powerful court. A small victory that offered a faint beacon of hope. Finally, the witch hunts simply didn't work. They were supposed to bring an end to misfortune, to protect communities from the devil's influence. But the crop still failed. The plagues still raged, and the wars continued. The executions didn't solve the underlying problems of society, and people eventually began to realize this. The perceived benefits of the hunts simply didn't materialize, leading to a slow, disillusioning realization that the terror had been for naught. It was like realizing that burning all your furniture didn't actually make your house warmer, just emptier. The fading fires of the witch hunts are a testament to humanity's slow, often painful, journey towards reason and compassion. The retreat was not linear. There were resurgences and local outbreaks of panic, even as the overall trend was downwards. But gradually, irrevocably, the madness receded. The belief in a literal, active devil working through human agents began to weaken, replaced by new understandings of the world, of disease, of misfortune. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief, the gradual lifting of a centuries-long nightmare, as the awful truth of the witch hunts finally began to fade into the shadowed pages of history. You've traced the arc of the witch hunts, from their ancient roots to their slow, agonizing decline. But numbers and trends, while important, can never fully capture the raw human cost of this terrifying period. To truly grasp the awful truth, you must look beyond the statistics and listen to the echoes of the accused, the individual stories of those whose lives were shattered by fear, prejudice, and the relentless machinery of persecution. Imagine their faces, their voices rising from the shadowed pages of history, each one a testament to unimaginable suffering and injustice. A common historical fact is that while the total number of victims is debated, estimates range from tens of thousands to over 100,000 individuals executed for witchcraft in Europe. Behind each of those numbers lies a person, a life, a family torn apart. These were not mythical figures, they were real people, living real lives, before the storm of accusations descended upon them. You might imagine a bustling market square filled with laughter and daily commerce, and then picture it silenced, haunted by the memory of a public execution. Let's consider a few fragments of these lives, pieced together from fragmented records. Think of Anna Goldie, often cited as the last witch executed in Europe. Her story, though later, in 1782 in Switzerland, encapsulates the enduring injustice. A common historical fact about her case is that she was accused of bewitching the children of her employer, a prominent judge, by putting pins in their milk. Her trial was heavily influenced by the judge's personal vendetta and the local authorities' desire to maintain order. You can picture her, a simple servant woman, caught in a web of powerful accusations, her pleas of innocence falling on deaf ears. Her execution, long after the peak of the hunts, serves as a chilling reminder of how deeply ingrained the fear and prejudice remained. It's like finding out someone still uses a floppy disk in the age of cloud computing. Some old habits just die hard. Then there's the case of the Pendle witches in England, from 1612. This was a particularly intense local hunt, fueled by a combination of family feuds, poverty, and local superstitions. A common historical fact is that 10 people were executed, mostly women from two rival families, the Demdikes and the Chaddixes. Their confessions, extracted under duress, painted a vivid picture of demonic pacts and midnight meetings. You can imagine the tension in that small Lancashire community, where every misfortune, every unexplained illness, was attributed to the maleficium of these families. The accusations spiraled, with family members accusing each other, desperate to save themselves. It was a true Shakespearean tragedy, but without the fancy costumes and poetic dialogue, a unique and particularly poignant detail from the Pendle trials involves the testimony of a 9-year-old girl, Janet Device. Her testimony was crucial in condemning several individuals, including her own mother, brother, and sister. Imagine the weight of that on a child, whether coerced or genuinely believing what she said. Her words, innocent in their delivery, sealed the fate of her family. This highlights the terrifying power given to even the most vulnerable accusers, and the devastating impact it had on family bonds. It's a stark reminder that even children can be unwitting instruments of immense cruelty. Consider the German territories, which saw some of the largest and most brutal witch hunts. In places like Bamberg and Würzburg, hundreds were executed in a few short years during the early 17th century. These were not just isolated cases, they were mass persecutions, driven by zealous prince-bishops and a pervasive sense of panic. You might envision entire towns gripped by terror, with accusations flying indiscriminately, sweeping up people from all walks of life, rich and poor, young and old, even members of the clergy. The sheer scale of it is almost incomprehensible, a relentless grinding machine of death. One such victim in Bamberg was Johannes Junius, the mayor of Bamberg himself, executed in 1628. A common historical fact is that he was a respected public figure, yet even his status could not protect him from the accusations. His letters from prison, smuggled out to his daughter, are heartbreaking. He details his torture, his forced confession, and his desperate pleas of innocence. "I am innocent," he wrote. "I am innocent. I am innocent." You can almost hear his voice, hoarse with pain and despair, echoing across the centuries. His case powerfully illustrates that no one was truly safe once the hysteria took hold. Regardless of their standing in society, it's like being the captain of a ship, only to find yourself thrown overboard by your own crew. Historians still debate the extent to which these individual stories truly represent the broader patterns of the witch hunts, or if they are simply the most dramatic and well-documented cases. Are they outliers, or do they illuminate the common experience of the accused? It's a crucial question, isn't it? While each story is unique, they collectively paint a devastating picture of systemic injustice. Then there are the stories of those who, against all odds, managed to escape. Think of the few who were acquitted, or those whose cases were dismissed on appeal to higher courts. Their survival was often a matter of luck, a slight shift in legal procedure, or the intervention of a skeptical judge. These rare instances offer a glimmer of hope, but they also underscore the arbitrary nature of the trials. You might hear a tale of someone who survived the water ordeal, or whose witch's mark was deemed natural by a more enlightened physician. These were the exceptions that proved the terrifying rule. The echoes of the accused are not just tales of suffering, they are also powerful reminders of resilience and the human spirit's capacity to endure. Even in the face of unimaginable terror, they remind you of the courage it took to maintain innocence under torture, or to speak out against injustice when doing so could cost you your life. Their stories are a testament to the fragility of justice and the enduring power of human cruelty when fueled by fear and superstition. As you reflect on these individual lives, these shattered dreams and stolen futures, you begin to understand the true, awful truth of the witch hunts. It wasn't just about abstract theological debates or broad societal trends. It was about people like you, caught in a nightmare they couldn't escape. Their whispers, their cries, their final moments still echo through the corridors of history, urging you to remember, to learn, and to ensure that such madness never grips humanity again. You've journeyed through the dark heart of European history, witnessing the rise and fall of the witch hunts, feeling the chill of fear, the sting of accusation, and the agony of injustice. Now, as the final chapter unfolds, you must consider the enduring legacy of this horrifying period. The fires may have died out centuries ago. The laws against witchcraft may have been repealed, but the awful truth of what happened continues to cast a long shadow, offering stark warnings that resonate even in your modern world. Imagine standing on a quiet, wind-swept hill, looking down at the scattered ruins of an ancient village. The air is still, but if you listen closely, you might hear the faint echoes of the past, not the screams, but the whispers of caution. This is a common historical fact the witch hunts, despite their brutality, offer invaluable lessons about human nature, societal vulnerability, and the dangers of unchecked power and mass hysteria. They are not merely a morbid curiosity, they are a mirror reflecting our own potential for both cruelty and resilience. It's like looking at an old, faded photograph. The details might be blurred, but the message is still crystal clear. One of the most profound lessons is the danger of scapegoating. When societies face overwhelming problems, be it climate change, economic hardship, or social unrest, there is a powerful human tendency to seek an external enemy, a convenient target for blame. The witch hunts show us what happens when that tendency runs rampant. When complex problems are reduced to simplistic explanations and innocent individuals are demonized. You might recognize echoes of this in your own time, in the way certain groups are vilified for societal ills, or how fear is used to divide and conquer. It's a timeless pattern, unfortunately, like that one friend who always blames the remote when the TV isn't working. The witch hunts also serve as a chilling reminder of the fragility of justice and the importance of due process. When fear and prejudice take hold, legal safeguards can be easily eroded, leading to arbitrary arrests, forced confessions, and convictions based on flimsy evidence or outright fantasy. The stories of torture, of spectral evidence, of children's coerced testimonies underscore the critical need for a robust legal system that protects the innocent, even when public opinion demands swift and brutal justice. You might reflect on the importance of independent courts, the right to a fair trial, and the presumption of innocence, principles that were utterly absent for the accused witches. A unique and particularly sobering detail is how the witch hunts, in some regions, actually led to improvements in legal procedures. The sheer scale and absurdity of some of the later trials, particularly when prominent citizens began to be accused, forced legal scholars and authorities to reevaluate their methods. The excesses became so undeniable that they prompted reforms, leading to stricter rules of evidence and a greater emphasis on verifiable facts over confessions extracted under duress. It's a grim irony, isn't it, that such immense suffering could inadvertently pave the way for progress, like a forest fire clearing the way for new growth, but at a terrible cost. The gendered nature of the witch hunts, which we explored in Chapter 7, also leaves an indelible mark. It highlights the historical vulnerability of women to patriarchal structures and the devastating consequences of misogyny when it is amplified by religious zeal and societal panic. The witch became a symbol of female power, both feared and reviled, and the hunt served, in part, as a brutal mechanism of social control. You might consider how these historical prejudices continue to influence contemporary attitudes towards women, even in subtle ways, reminding you that the fight for equality is an ongoing one. Historians still debate the full extent to which the legacy of the witch hunts has shaped modern Western thought. Did they contribute to a greater emphasis on scientific rationality, a rejection of superstition, or a deeper appreciation for individual liberties? Or are there echoes more subtle, lingering in our collective unconscious, shaping our anxieties about the other and our susceptibility to mass hysteria? It's a complex and ongoing academic discussion, like trying to figure out if your ancestors' weird habits are why you always put your socks on inside out. The witch hunts also teach us about the power of belief and the dangers of fanaticism. When a society becomes convinced of an invisible enemy, and when that conviction is fueled by religious dogma or ideological fervor, the capacity for cruelty becomes almost limitless. The belief in a literal devil and his earthly agents provided the ultimate justification for unimaginable acts of violence. You might see parallels in history, and even in your own time, where fervent belief in an abstract evil has led to the persecution of real people. Finally, the echoes of the accused serve as a powerful call to empathy and critical thinking. They urge you to question authority, to scrutinize narratives of blame, and to stand up for the marginalized and the accused, even when it is unpopular or dangerous to do so. They remind you that the line between order and chaos, between justice and tyranny, can be terrifyingly thin, and that vigilance is always required to protect the fragile fabric of a just society. You might feel a quiet resolve, a determination to listen more closely, to question more deeply, to ensure that such an awful truth is never repeated. As you drift now, the stories of the past gently receding, remember the lessons etched in the shadows of those long extinguished fires. The witch hunts were a dark chapter, a testament to humanity's capacity for fear and cruelty, but also a powerful reminder of our enduring struggle for reason, compassion, and justice. May the echoes of the accused serve not to haunt your dreams, but to illuminate your understanding, guiding you toward a more thoughtful and humane future.